I'm Jim Collison, live from the Gallup studios here in Omaha, Nebraska. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on June 27th, 2018. On this special edition of Call to Coach, we'll spend some time investigating the experience, emotion, and empirical aspects of each element of Gallup's Q12 engagement instrument. And we want to know how to increase the power of it in our coaching as a primary driver of success. If you have questions during this webcast, we do have a live chat room available for you right down there, right down below the main video window. We'd love to have you log in. Bottom left-hand corner is a login button. Choose the guest account. Take out the name and the numbers. Put your name in so we know who you are. Hit submit. We'll take your questions live during the program. If you're listening to the recorded version of this and you have questions afterwards, you can send those to us in an email. Send it to coaching@gallup.com. There's also a contact form right there on the live page. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com. For all your CliftonStrengths coaching resources and training needs, you can also catch the video and downloadable audio for offline listening. We call that podcasting. Available on a subscription basis. You can get that automatically downloaded to your phone. All the instructions on how to do that is on the resources tab out of the coach's blog, coaching.gallup.com. Oh, one more thing. Don't forget, if you're listening on your iPhone, you can subscribe, rate, and review right there in the app. We'd love to have you review the podcast. Give us some feedback on that. If you're listening on YouTube and you want to get notification every time we go live, just subscribe to the live channel. There's a recorded channel as well. Either way, you'll get notified when new videos are available for you. And if you're listening on Spreaker, you can follow us. That as well will send you notification whenever we go live. Mike McDonald is our host today. He works as a senior workplace consultant here on the riverfront with me. Mike, great to see you, and welcome to another Call to Coach.
Yeah, here we are again, Jim. Q2.
Good to be back together again. Yeah, we're going to talk about Q2, and this is a hot item. We talked about Q1 last week and how you kind of got to get that one right. Otherwise, the rest of them really struggle to matter a little bit. Q2 is important because it lives in that kind of the base of expectations in the workplace. Let's talk a little bit about it. I think we've got some things to cover first before we dig in. Let's blow through those things as well.
Yeah, right on. Well, we want to make sure we acclimate everybody to the reference points that are being used throughout our conversation. So materials and equipment, right? We would want to make sure we know exactly what materials and equipment we're using in our discussion. So let's touch on each of those and enter on into our conversation about what that element of engagement actually represents. So we do want to make sure that for all of you that not only are you aware of the resources that we're referencing and integrating into our conversation, but that they would provoke additional use, that there'd be some utility to them that would have some staying power beyond our conversations. And so I just want to make sure I reintroduce many of you to those as well. So we're really driving off the core of our conversations really comes from our book, First Break All the Rules. Jim, I was noticing the other day that was on the New York Times bestseller list for 93 weeks.
Holy moly.
It seems like a long time.
It was in its day, and it still is, to be honest with you, but in its day, it was kind of groundbreaking. There's a lot of things we take for granted today, or management ideas that weren't being talked about then. So you got to remember that when you're reading that book.
Yeah, absolutely. So make sure when you, if you're referencing that book, if you haven't purchased it yet, that there is the newest edition that just came out a couple of years ago. It's very unique. It really expands on the first edition, obviously, but 2 points that we really want to bring to your attention. One is there's a StrengthsFinder Code embedded in that book. Very useful, as we all know. But also uniquely embedded in that book is a code for a team of 10 people, up to 10 people, to take the Q12. And it produces a nice, clean report with a lot of content and insight based around the engagement level of that team overall, and as a breakout of each particular item. And I know Jim and a variety of other folks use that book in a really scalable way, and everything from introducing a key leader to being coached on their strengths and thinking about engagement as an outcome that leads to other outcomes as they think about how their leadership affects and influences their team. And it can be scaled up or down, large or small. And so it's a very useful resource beyond just the amazing content within it. Some other things that we'll really integrate into our conversation as well. I want to make sure we all have eyes and ears on another book that Gallup's put out. It's 12, The Elements of Great Managing. A lot of qualitative case studies that are brought to bear around each of the 12 elements of engagement as Gallup explores engagement around the world. And in our own reports, our State of the Workplace report that just came out in 2017, State of the American workplace report. And that's got a specific emphasis on remote teams and matrixed teams. And so we'll make some references to what does question number 2, what role does it play in engaging those particular team dynamics? Obviously, our millennial report, we'll talk about millennials and what's at stake in the millennial generation and their engagement, and what role does Q2 play in that. And then bringing it all to bear around management and performance of management, the management of performance, rather, where we think about what is it to be developed as a person, who you are in your own learning and growing, but also in your own performance and productivity. And so, again, having the materials and equipment to do the job right is a critical feature of all of those pieces that we'll try to bring to the story as we have our conversation today.
Mike, if for folks that need access to those resources, by the way, we have the first 2 linked out at the coaches blog. So if you go to coaching.gallup.com, click on the resources tab, scroll down to the bottom, or there's an anchor there for reports. If you go down to the report sections, everything that we have available for you from reporting, or the most important things, are listed there. I do need to add the re-engineering performance management one. So if you're listening to this fairly soon, chances are I may not have it out there yet. If you're 6 months from now, we probably have it available for you. But if you can't find it, just Google re-engineering performance management. We own that tag. And so you should be able to find that pretty easily and download that free report.
Yeah, that's awesome. That is awesome.
All right, let's dig in on this question.
Yeah. Let's dive in. So again, and we're really trying to bring to the surface those 3 touch points of the empirical, the emotional, and the experiential. So you should have some of those, again, bubbling up throughout our conversation. And again, we want to give you enough that you've got some really attractive bait on your hook as you invite and provoke some of these conversations within your own coaching. That you have every unique feature at your disposal in your portfolio to really capture the attention of that person that you're coaching, leading them to their own solutions. So we'll walk that out as we have our discussion. But Jim, it was really fun. Really, it's interesting. Question number 2, it's got a lot of similarities to question number 1. We can talk about expectations. Seems really straightforward and almost dangerously transactional. I think we kind of exposed that it's not quite as linear of a question and answer as what it might seem like on the surface. And there's a lot of parallel with question number 2. At work, I have the materials and equipment I need to do the job right. Again, seems very straightforward. And I think that's kind of the trick and a little bit of the deception, that people underestimate those 2 items. And to your point earlier, how foundational they are. We assume that once we've answered them once, then they're answered forever, and we can just move on to other things. And we really want to make sure that we kind of break through that myth and make sure that mirage that's out there doesn't trick us or deceive us into leading teams in the wrong direction behind the wrong motivations as well. So one of the things that really surfaces, we think about a variety of stories that bring this element to life, and we bring things in from everywhere to try to highlight these examples and make a connection to them. But about 20 years ago, Jim, there was a movie that came out that was pretty noteworthy, and it was a comedy, but it had some thinly veiled truth behind it. Got a lot of attention, and for those folks who read the Dilbert comic strip series, this was really a movie based around the central feature of Dilbert, right? But it was a movie that brought that to life through living characters, live characters, real people, and was a comedy that had a tongue-in-cheek reflection of what was going on in the workplace or not going on in the workplace. And so one of the central features, for those of you familiar with the movie, and if you haven't seen the movie, it would be well worth your time to check it out. It's at least recreational and fun, if not giving some pretty comedic reference points to engagement. But one of the central characters in the movie is a gentleman by the name of Milton Wadhams, and Milton just has these intermittent appearances throughout the movie, but he's centrally fixated on his swing line stapler. And it's almost become iconic now. You'll see people on their desks have the symbolic swing line stapler, red swing line stapler. And in the movie, Milton is fixated on that stapler because he has a very strong preference for its features and its functionality. And there's a quote in here that I want to bring out that really captures the essence of question number 2. And this is Milton, in his own words, talking about his stapler. But then they switched me from the swing line to the Boston stapler. but I kept my swing line stapler because it didn't bind up as much. And I kept the staples for the swing line stapler as well. And it's not okay, because if they take my stapler, I'm going to set the building on fire. and so he orients and just fixates around this stapler, and they move him all over, and there's all sorts of, marginalization that Milton suffers. But the central feature in his world is, does he or not have that red swing line stapler? And you can see the intensity of his reaction. If it's threatened to be taken away from him, that he's literally going to just jump all the way to the extreme. He's going to burn the building down. And so while we can laugh at that in one essence, it really does bring out just the affinity and the preference, not just in terms of the functionality, but our psychological motivation behind what we have and how confident we feel in what we can do with our own materials and resources. So there's a little bit of insight right there already, that it's just not that straightforward of an item that we manage to lead to.
Mike, what I find in the onboarding process is oftentimes individuals have a very different perception of what that need is. And oftentimes in HR groups or, whatever groups help do the onboarding, we try to standardize everything. Yeah, right. And rightly so. Individualization is very, very expensive, right? Mm-hmm. It's not scalable in a lot of cases. And so a lot of organizations have moved towards this idea of getting it standardized. Everybody gets the same thing, standard issue. Can you kind of address that a little bit when we think about this? Because this isn't a movement, I don't think, of standardization versus individualization, mm-hmm. but talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Jim, because there is sanity and intelligence, right, about being strategic and efficient and streamlined in as much of our process as we can. But if we do it right, it actually should create space for the spontaneity and the involvement of those conversations that reveal, what is it about materials equipment for you, Jim, that answers that question? What is it for me that answers that question, or for any of us that answers that question? So there's that balance between systemization, right, and customization in terms of the conversations that should be had and produced as part of that. And onboarding is a great example. We'll have a lot of conversation about onboarding later on, specifically as it relates to materials and equipment. But I'll tell you, Jim, what the central feature here that just can't be missed, and I'm just going to tell us what we already know, but just to emphasize this, is we just can't skip the conversation around these seemingly quote unquote transactional elements of engagement, particularly question 1 and 2. And I have a great story that I think brings to light the importance of that conversation and what question number 2 really does tell us. And so we had a client out on the West Coast. It was a hospital that we were working with, and they were doing the Q12, and in their first administration, the item of question number 2 was not a strong score for them at all. But they skipped the conversation. They had a very well-intended leader. She was in charge of their nursing staff, and she was just going to jump to the end and make a really positive but incorrect assumption that if she just sent out an email to everybody on her nursing team, and this was the dream list, Jim, this was the blank check wish list. She put it out to them and she said, let me know whatever you want to do your jobs. It just let your heart's desire be responded back, and I'll just create a list out of that. And she fought for a very large budget, tens of thousands of dollars, and then went out and literally purchased everything on the list. So next administration, the Q12 comes around, and they all take part, and the scores come out, and that score did not move at all. And so she was really disappointed, because it was so well intended, and doesn't it sound great to make all your dreams come true? And so then this time, lesson learned, she actually had the conversation with her team around question number 2 specifically, and really focused in on that, because this is a nursing unit, right? Materials and equipment in every environment and set of circumstances is important, but just think about what that means, right, for them to do their jobs well, and what that particularly means for us if those nurses are doing their jobs well. And so having the conversation, one of the nurses spoke up and she said, well, I'll be honest, I loved the invitation for the wish list. Like, who wouldn't love that? But that wasn't really the core of what I needed. She goes, quite frankly, she goes, if we were just to think about it, or at least in my own interpretation and experience, she goes, I probably spend an inordinate and unproductive amount of time every time I come onto a shift, having to go through the supply room and restock it with all the things that it's supposed to have all of the time anyway. And she goes, so I'm chasing things around constantly, and I never know what to expect every time I start my shift. And so then all the other nurses really kind of sat up straight, and they were like, oh, you know what? That's exactly it. I guess, that really strikes a chord for all of us. So Jim, the end of the story is they simply made a shift in their policy so that every outgoing nursing shift, the last thing they did before they closed out their shift was to restock the supply room to make sure it was good to go for the oncoming shift of nurses. Predictably, a year later, they take the Q12. It's one of the strongest scores and shows great movement. So you just think about the contrast, Jim, for having had the conversation or not, spend tens of thousands of dollars and get no traction and do not impact engagement at all, or have the right conversation the right way and directly intervene and creatively come up with a very simple, straightforward solution that produces a great outcome.
Yeah, I love that example because it really speaks to, when we say materials and equipment, we think it can be computers, or we think it can be offices, or we think it, in a lot of organizations, to this example, it means the commitment of having everything I need to do my job. And sometimes there are other people who you rely on to have those materials available for you. Mm-hmm. Thinking of manufacturing, where I might need, the team ahead of me may need to produce things differently or provide it to me differently to be able to do that. That's nothing you can go to Costco or Office Max or fill in the big box store of choice. You don't order that on a supply catalog, right? Mm-hmm. That is really a team conversation. That's where it's important that these team conversations happen, right? When we think about productivity. So it's more of a productivity question than it is a item question. Although our science showed that's how we get to that question is materials and equipment, right? Those two words were very, very strategic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're exactly right too, that the range of what's represented in that item is really as infinite as the people who are answering that question. And so again, there's just no shortcut around the conversation. And so it brings our coaching to the centerpiece of what we know, right? We have to have the right conversations for us to have that mutual interpretation and agreement, and then it matters. And the emotion, though, the consistency of what's represented, regardless of our answers, the core motivation and emotion is really represented in a request to be freed from unnecessary stress. And the gap that typically happens, right, is between items 1 and 2, where we have these expectations. And certainly in our best effort and our best intentions, we want to meet those expectations if they're clear enough for us. But then if the materials and equipment, whatever that is, in our own interpretation, falls short of supporting us in our desire to meet those expectations, that's a gap that has very disconnected and disruptive emotion represented within it. And so we want to make sure there's a reconciliation there between those two, because they really are bundled in their experience and how they make sense out of each other. One thing I was going to mention, Jim, and just kind of speaking to this, there's plenty of runway really in the world of engagement as we go through each of these items. But just for context, I think it's important as we think about the empirical. Right now, on average, only 3 in 10 employees can say that they strongly agree to that particular item. So again, the deception there is, while we think it's an easy item to manage and lead to, that it's easily answered, we're not hitting it. We're missing it far. It's like a batting average in Major League Baseball right now, right? We're hitting 300, and that's just not going to get the job done. But there's huge outcomes at stake, right, if we do it well, and particularly attached to that item. The 3 that really stand out that we ought to pay attention to is, if we're not hitting that item well, what's at stake is higher customer engagement. So we just can't deliver and impact our customers in the way that we would ideally like to. It obviously compromises our productivity and performance. But even getting into safety, Jim, when we think about that engagement-driven peripheral awareness that we have, if we have to constantly worry about Band-Aids and baling wire and paper clips to try to patchwork together the instruments and items that we need to do the job right, that robs us of the attention that we could be discretionarily and voluntarily involving to assist other people to do their job better, or to extend ourselves to a more involved and present degree to impact a customer. So we have a finite amount of energy and attention, and if we have to devote it to this patchwork set of solutions for materials and equipment, then that takes us away from impact, from value. And quite frankly, that frustration does cause us to eventually just say enough, and we just leave, right? And so we see a strong correlation to turnover related to materials and equipment as well.
Like one of the numbers I think I remember from the overall report when we talked about engagement is a 41% safety, right? We
Right.
increase safety by 41% in organizations that are more engaged, that they can
Yeah.
answer that, right? And so that's a big number, and I think this idea of safety plays big in this Q2, because if people don't feel like they have the right materials, like you said, one, either they walk away because they don't feel safe, or
Yeah.
two, they engage in the activity knowing it can cause harm, right?
Yeah.
Think about the stress associated with that.
Yeah.
Somebody high in empathy, and the stress that is associated with that, knowing that, I could be harming myself or harming others in the
Mhm.
process. And so really, really important question on that. We think of some areas where this kind of pops in. I mentioned one of them earlier. Maybe we could dig in a little bit on it. And I want to go beyond onboarding, because I think a lot of people think this is an onboarding question. You mentioned earlier, hey, today's your first day. Do you have everything you need? And they go, yes. And you go, check. I'm never going
Yeah.
to answer that question again. It goes beyond that. But let's start with that. Let's thinking about how that fits when we think about the roles of onboarding.
Yeah, onboarding specifically. No, there's some really powerful figures that we discovered when we think about onboarding. So here's what's interesting: when we think about engagement overall, typically the high point of engagement in a typical career tenure is when people start that job. And so think about the fact that you start, and I think there's a call to action around this in our coaching and for leadership and managers in general. But think about the fact that our team members enter an organization. Jim, think about your interns. Day one, and that first experience, really through their first 6 months, is the high point of engagement. And I always think the accountability there for us is, so if engagement only goes down from there, what happened? What didn't happen, right? And we see specific answers come up addressing materials and equipment that's part of that response. And so that notion that people come in engaged, but then something happens in the experience in the process that takes that engagement away, we need to respond to that better than what we currently are across the global landscape. And so right now, out of our State of the American Workplace report, one of the most searing takeaways in reference specifically to onboarding and just as a general takeaway overall is that only 12% of the United States workforce says that their organization does a great job of onboarding. Okay, so think about this. So the high point of engagement is when we first start that particular career or job. Only 12% of us say that our organization does a great job of onboarding. The sharpest drop in engagement really comes after that first 6 months. So we see a dip, very pronounced dip that comes in terms of engagement overall. However, within that overall dip of engagement, the downward slope is not consistent. It's not an even drop across all 12 elements. And as you can tell, as I lead the witness in this story, the steepest drop actually occurs in item number 2, materials and equipment, where literally the level of engagement around that item drops to half after 6 months into the job. And so just imagine you come in with energy, emotion, optimism, perhaps some clarity about what you're expected to do. But we know that that's only 50-50, right? Only 50% are saying yes to that. But then very quickly, that gap of materials and equipment, or whatever the answer to that question is for us, becomes very, very pronounced in what our expectations were and are in that new phase of our career to really deliver, with all the momentum behind us. So there's an intervention zone there, Jim, for us to really step into. And again, not underestimate or miss the mark when we think about onboarding specifically.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that onboarding conversation. It's super easy to get that part right early on, but then you got to come back around and check that. Like you gotta be very intentional about coming back to that. And like, you've been here 6 months. Oftentimes, Mike, in organizations like Gallup, I see this all the time, where roles have changed within 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
People are doing different things within the role, and I think the manager needs to double check that. Hey, I know I put you in a new situation. Do you still have everything you need? The other, as you're learning and growing, right? And that
Right.
the other thing we see sometimes are those elements that are out of our control. Big emphasis on info security, on cyber security, on locking things down. And I can't tell you how many times I've been locked out and locked down on things I need to do my job, right? I work on Facebook. That's part of my job here at Gallup, is to monitor and track and stay up to date with what's going on in our Facebook community. And our own systems here locked me out of being able to upload things I needed to upload to Facebook. terribly frustrating when we're trying to do that in the middle of a show, and I'm trying to get information out to somebody, and I get the security warning that says you've been locked out and you're not going to be able to upload that because we're afraid, the intention is right, but is it stopping me from doing my job? Yeah. And I've been here 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. And so you just, and by the way, the system is right. It's doing the right thing. It's just in that moment, I need an opportunity to say, hey guys, okay, we're going to have to make some exceptions or something, right? If I don't have that voice,
right.
Very, very frustrating, especially in moments of high stress when you're trying to do customer delivery, or you have deliveries that you've promised on, and then these barriers get in the way. Is something as easy as a firewall, right?
Yeah.
It can be very, very frustrating. Yeah. I think, Mike, in the context of I think this is really, really important too. When we think of, you mentioned teams and team deliverables. In other words, when you're on a team and you're waiting for another team to deliver, Eduardo said he was coaching in an area culinary school. I'm going to paraphrase this, but there was some discrepancies between the morning crew coming in and the evening crew going out, and what was kind of are there Band-Aids and stuff, except is it clean? I mean, think about that. The morning crew or the afternoon crew coming in a restaurant, if it's filthy because the evening crew did not clean it, right? What's the expectation? Can they do their job if they're spending 2 hours cleaning that up before they come in? But matrix teams, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is, in the gig economy and a lot of the things that we're doing, this is a really, really important section. We spend a lot of time talking about this in the State of the American Workplace, but what are the pressures there, and how does this fit in?
Yeah. Well, I love the lead in that Eduardo gives us, because, we think about, again, that these are physical features, that they're chairs or desks and things like that. And while they may be, the statement behind them is very personal and very relational. So I want to play off of what Eduardo mentioned. How does that feel necessarily, right? How does that feel for him to walk in and see the conditions, the materials and equipment environment that he's stepping into to be so shoddy, to be so haphazard? And just what's the statement that's made there in terms of, Jim, do I care enough about you to even extend my own input, the information I know, and share that relationally with you in a way that you're not compromised? What does that mean as a statement and an outcome in terms of that relational connection? And so there's a bigger arena that this question really occupies that I think has to be taken into account. And we see that played out in matrixed teams as well. So when you think about the rate and the dynamics, ever increasing sophistication of our workplace around planet Earth right now, and the way different individuals and teams are coming together, taking on problems and challenges, finding solutions, and then they disband and then they move on to yet another challenge. Very, very active, and a lot of speed around that as we think about materials and equipment and the need to share information, particularly in terms of how that happens. And we see a compromise there, or an exposure, when we think about matrix teams. And one of the things that the key takeaways in our State of the American Workplace report is that matrixed teams, those highly matrixed teams, spend an inordinate amount of time having to chase down information, having to get access to the right materials and equipment, the right resources. And so there's so much sense making that they're involved with, that they actually report that they spend less time working and focusing on priorities than the non-matrix teams. And so some of that makes sense, but when we think of the advantages represented by matrix teams, we should be able to answer that question better. And if we do, we can have so much more optimal productivity and performance and meaningfulness about what it means to be part of that team. But we just can't miss the mark on that item, especially when we consider the dynamics of that matrix team group coming together around that project.
It's one of those areas where the Q12 is really powerful, not in the sense of just the question, but and also in the mode. So as a manager having matrix teams, you're oftentimes you can't ask that question just casually. Mm-hmm. You got to be able to kind of ask it in a systematic, routine way, where taking the assessment, the tool, we talk about all these things is you can just ask these people on the fly, right? And you can, but the value of running them through this an organized assessment in our system is to be able to get those reports, compare them to the national averages and all those other things. We're going to cover that later, towards the end here as we talk about that. But to have that systematic approach, it also helps people see, hey, there's someone, this is the chance for me to say something.
Yeah. You know what I love about that, Jim, is that here's what will happen. If we don't treat that question well, we can mass produce victims in our workplace, right? Because if we don't give you the opportunity to have that conversation, Jim, and to speak into what you need and answer it capably or resolve it capably, then you can just put your hands up in the air and just say, well, guess what? I don't have what I need. I'm not connected to any sort of resolution or progress towards acquiring what I need. So if I'm disconnected from that, guess what else I can disconnect from? The rest of my effort in doing my job well, right? And so now all of a sudden we start to withdraw and disqualify ourselves from doing anything of value or performance. And so everything's up for grabs, right? And so we can mass produce victims if we don't answer that question well. And one of the most simple but yet powerful ways that I've seen this question phrased or led to by really capable team leaders is when they have these conversations, because sometimes, Jim, we'll ask for things that there really is a limitation to, right? There isn't the budget for some things, or the timing isn't right for some things. And so while we may prefer to have it now, we may have to have a little bit of a delayed gratification in our approach and our expectation around that. But the best leaders, what I've seen them do, and literally it's as simple as this, they'll just draw a line down the middle of a piece of paper. And then when they're having a team feedback session around what that item looks like, on one side of the piece of paper, they'll write down local. And on the other side of the piece of paper, they'll write down leadership. And what they do is when they go through their feedback session or coaching with that individual or team is they're sorting through what are the things that we locally have within our ability to influence, our span of control as a team, and what can we creatively do around that? So think about that nursing example. They had within their span of influence the ability to just change a simple policy. If you, at the end of your shift, restock the supply room. And so lots of teams have just many, many inroads to creative solutions if they have the right conversation and really collaborate and join in their talents, their insight, and their expertise to really, again, mutually interpret what that could look like and arrive at a really great solution with buy-in and ownership. But then for those items that really are things that senior leadership needs to pay attention to, where it's a corporate policy or it's an allocation of a very significant budget that's outside of that division or team's ability to directly influence, they'll keep track of that, and they have credibility. They have more credibility because they've had that engagement conversation representing their team to translate that message up to senior leadership. And while they may not get the answer they want or to get an answer right away, they'll keep that list and they'll keep it active and they'll revisit that periodically. Maybe it's every quarter, maybe it's every 6 months or at the end of every year, but they keep that list for leadership alive. And it's real keen insight, powerful insight for a senior leadership team to be able to stay connected to what the pulse and the needs are of the team members throughout the organization, just through the simple possession of that list and the appropriate and effective communication delivered, all oriented around answers and responses and opinions to Q2.
Mike, let's spend a little bit of time as we think about team leader insights, because the manager's a little bit on the hook for this. Yeah. Not totally, by the way, but what are some insights that we've learned through that for the team lead?
Yeah, absolutely. So some real key takeaways. I think there's 3 specific that broadly represent question number 2. And I'll just kind of touch on each of those here fairly quickly. But first and foremost, no surprise, there is a hardware aspect of it. There's a variety of work environments, and for some people, it literally can be, I want a bigger hammer. You know, for some people, it can be, I need a taller ladder or one that's got more stability to it, what so have you. And what's really interesting though, Jim, even though it is hardware in seemingly straightforward in some of those types of environments, we've studied workplaces that are as uniform and consistent as you could possibly imagine. So think of the boxiest of box stores across the world, right? Think of those chain stores where literally the number of paper clips in the top left-hand drawer of that manager's desk is exactly the same in Bismarck, North Dakota, as it is in Berlin, Germany, right? And yet we will see, so seemingly on the surface, the access to materials and equipment is as uniform and even as it possibly could be. And maybe in the physical, it actually is. But in the relational, we see wide variation. In engagement, we see wide variation in the scores that are represented across those uniform work environments. And in so many cases, it has to do with the relationship connection of Jim, of you as my manager, just having a conversation with me and asking my opinion. Mike, how do you have enough paper clips? Do you need more? Do you like the big binder clips or the smaller ones? What serves your purpose most? And really what's happening there, quite frankly, Jim, is the fact that you're having an individualized conversation with me that's unique, that's personal, and really the outcome to a certain degree, whether it's big binder clips or small or what have you, more so the statement of that relationship and the value that you're communicating to me in that conversation is what's at stake there. That's really what's up for grabs. And that feels great when we evolve ourselves in that way. But the hardware is part of that, but let's not miss the mark in terms of what's wrapped around that if we do it well. Another aspect of it is software, right? And software isn't necessarily just technology. It can be technology, and we know that there's huge advantages to what that means in our ability to do our job well. But it also has to do with efficiency around processes, and particularly access to information. Huge value statement made in terms of barriers of access to information, or if teams or team members feel like they have to halt their stride or adjust the speed that they want to work at because they're waiting for a team leader to give them the right information in the right way at the right time in order for them to go as fast as they can to get the job done. And so when you think about your engagement and your management of engagement, those who are most engaged are moving incredibly fast. They're your pace setters. But if you want to take their legs out from underneath them and to really attack their engagement that they already have, the momentum to sustain through that, make them pause and wait for information. Make them have to hold up and ask repeatedly for the right information to do their job well. That can siphon the energy and momentum and engagement out of a team as fast as anything. Or you can lead proactively and futuristically through that and pull them forward at an accelerated rate by providing that. And again, that's an individualized, customized delivery. How does Jim like his information versus how Mike likes to have his? When, how much, et cetera. That conversation really delivers directly to that. And there's a huge data point to that to really underscore that, Jim, that came out of some of our own research. But right now, only 13% of employees strongly agree that the leadership of their organization communicates effectively with the rest of the organization. So when you think of that overarching need for information, to feel like we matter because of the way information is being delivered to us, we're failing at an alarming rate when we think that only 13% can strongly agree that the leadership of their organization communicates effectively. The third piece then is just human resources, humanware, we would call it, or staffing. And so the request there is, or the cue or the listen for there is just, we feel overworked and understaffed, and so what are we going to do to come together to figure out our own span of influence, span of control solutions towards priorities and how we organize ourselves as a team or partnerships, or realign what we do best through great coaching, great team leadership to arrive at the best solutions and the most of those solutions that we possibly can by, again, having an organized conversation that focuses and prioritizes question number 2.
I think sometimes that statement, overworked and understaffed, is actually a direct result of lack of control and not actual workload. It is the case in a lot of ways, but when people don't control their own destiny, they often feel overworked or understaffed. That's a really common indication. If you're hearing that, I think sometimes you need to kind of ask the question, how much control that you have. Mike, you didn't list this, but as a manager, I think sometimes I am part of the humanware experience. In other words, does my staff have enough access to me?
Yeah.
And this year, I mean, I'm always learning on this. And this year, I didn't schedule as many one-on-one. Interns are here for the summer. We have less than we had last year. I didn't schedule time for them to meet with me, and I'm starting to get some feedback from them. It's like, we'd like more time. Right. Yeah. And one of the things, and I just need to learn to do this, is let them set that frequency with me. Some will want to set it weekly. Some will want it to be once a month. But to say on day one, set a time with me that works well for you. And we can always back it down or speed it up. But I want you to book that time with me. I want you to schedule it at a frequency that works for you. Give them control of that. Right. And I think you're going to find some of your staff will do it once a month. Some will want to do it every 6 months. Some will want to do it weekly. But that really sets the expectation for them. So that humanware just isn't their interaction with teams. but it's the interaction to their manager.
Yeah. Gosh, Jim, I had to write that down. That's a really smart point, and one that I for sure want to take away for our conversation. But you know what it reemphasizes to me, and again, another point from a report that we referenced earlier in our conversation, but the reengineering performance management report that we put out, the key takeaway there is as we look across the landscape of performance development conversations, and we identified 5 that contribute to optimized performance development for a person and across an organization. There's 5 conversations that we identified that matter. And we looked at the content, the frequency, the cadence of what those conversations look like. But the one, and Jim, this is encouraging for every team leader and for our coaching, and the point that you just made, the one that explains engagement the most is the literal quick connect, which almost looks like the water cooler conversation on surface. It's a 5 to 10 minute discussion that should happen at least weekly. But to your point, Jim, access to manager, what's really conveyed in that conversation is availability and accountability. And so, Jim, by me touching base with you for 5 to 10 minutes that day or that week, and just asking you how things are going, and expressing the fact that I'm there to celebrate with you if they're going well, or to remove barriers if you need an ally, if you need a co-pilot or a partner, that I'm there to join forces with you as well, that I'm available, but also that you're accountable, Jim, because I'm asking you about it. And that keeps the intensity or the edges around the expectation, right, that you are going to move forward with it. And we're removing any excuses or things that might get in your way as we arrive at success. So I love the fact that access to manager, as you brought up, is such a key part of question number 2, and an easy one that we can deliver on if we just pay attention to it.
In a very fast-moving organization, that is oftentimes where the slippage is just access to each other.
Yeah.
I might need access to people and I can't get them in an information organization like Gallup, where we don't create widgets for the most part. It's all about people, right? Mike, if I'm trying to do Q12 for coaches and I don't have any access to you, it's going to be really hard for us to connect on this, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult. We've got some best practices when we think about, and we've covered some of these, but let's quickly work through what are some of the best practices, some of the things that we need to do. What are the best to do?
Absolutely. The best and the lead into all of this really is, this conversation is fantastic when it's had proactively, right? So the best team leaders are constantly in tune with asking and inquiring of their teams, do you need something to do your job better, or what do you need to do your job better? And so they're out in front, they're upstream of ever having to be, or at least shrinking that window where they're having to respond to requests. They don't wait for things to get broken and then ask, what do you need? They anticipate, hey, if we were to identify a threat or a risk to our job performance around a notion of materials and equipment, what might that look like? Where do you sense that to be? And do we need to create some solutions or contingencies up front that might address that? Again, so there's an art and a science really to what that question allows us to accomplish in the delivery and the answer. But lots of our best practice team leaders really pay attention to the positioning of where they're having those conversations around question number 2. The other thing they do really well in terms of driving the power of that item is that they become advocates as a result of having that conversation around that item with their teams. And so when I talked earlier about that list of what's local versus what needs to be influenced at the leadership level, so many team leaders they know when they walk into that conversation with their superior or their boss, and they've got that list that's got credibility and clout and merit to it, because what that list represents is untapped performance, untapped motivation. And so their seat at the table has so much weight now because they've got a list that matters, and it was accumulated through a really healthy, productive conversation. So their advocacy probably will never have more power than representing the conversation around Q2. The other thing they do is they're very transparent. Resolution, as much as anything, is really the primary outcome. And I think we've all had requests for things where the answer was just a flat out no. And Jim, to your point earlier, that might be laws that prevent us from doing certain things, policies, regulations, things where safety might be at risk, confidentiality might be at risk. And we just have to adhere to that. And we just have to manage the expectation. We've been heard. We know what's represented behind that request, but in terms of its straightforward delivery in that moment, it's a no. So now it's left upon us to have productive, great conversations, collaborative conversations as a team or a partnership or with our team leader that arrive at those solutions. But again, when we lead through engagement, it recasts that to where it's a zero-sum situation where it's like, I asked for this, I didn't get it, so I'm at a net negative. We still keep that conversation alive and we claim whatever advance we can towards that solution and that outcome that's really represented behind that request. And at the very least, we felt valued because we at least had the conversation in the first place, which a lot of times we don't even get that chance if we don't, again, keep question number 2 in mind. And so that really thirdly brings to the last part, or to the last part really of what's represented behind this, but is really that conversation where it's collaborative, and the focus in that collaboration is whenever we come with a request, and I think as individual contributors, this is a way for us to position that request effectively, is to constantly be thinking about what is the outcome, honestly, on the other side of this request, and how do we make sure that performance is at the centerpiece of this. So Jim, when we think about the beginning and our hope for this entire series is the fact that we would be always pointed towards and aligned with outcomes and performance to whatever degree it uniquely matters within the teams and the workplaces that we're coaching to and with. And if we have outcomes at the center of that, it really helps answer a lot of questions around the why, according to the need that we have around materials and equipment. And what that does is it really broadens the perspective for each of us. It manages our expectations, and it really governs and guides what's most important versus what's just actually preferential. And so it helps really align all of us so that we're not getting into a competition, right? Hey, Jim got a red swing line stapler. I don't need one, but because Jim got one, I feel like I need to have one so I can have status, right? And it really helps sort through what's really an issue and what really is just static in that regard. So that's how the best lead.
It's a great overview, Mike, as we dig into this and kind of figure out, again, I think that accountability, that ownership and accountability that you mentioned at the end, it happens when we give the entire team the ability to influence that, right? To have some say in that, to have some influence over what happens and where we're going and what we're doing. So really, really, really important. The other mechanism that helps in this and why it's not just asking is enough sometimes is a regular interval, right? Is working through, we find the best organizations. I remember here at Gallup during the 2009 market turmoil, right? Some of the worst recession time here in the United States as we think about overall market loss, and everybody's worried about their job. It's kind of weird to think now that actually happened, 10 years ago, but we actually internally did the Q12 4 times that year. So we took it once a quarter ourselves to measure. I remember Jane saying, like, I want to make sure I understand what's going on, even though as managers we had buckled down to say, okay, let's make sure we're really conscious of all the things that are happening with our staff during this time and the things that are happening, that regular, consistent, and then the roll-ups that can only happen when it's administered through the assessment really, really do matter. And how are we doing, and how do we measure it, and how does it measure up against the last time? Those things are really, really important.
Yeah, it speaks to that physical, we talk a lot about safety from the physical aspect of it, but Jim, I think what you're speaking to, there's a psychological safety, right? That's really communicated and I think supported in that cadence that you referenced. And I think that's what was really on display in that 2009 experience. The fact that we did have those conversations and a polarized attention that really gathered us all together 4 times a year rather than twice really allowed us to be positioned in a way where we just felt safer emotionally, psychologically, relationally, because we just had a stronger network that I think really provided sustainability and resiliency through a pretty challenging time really for the world at that point. I
kind of felt like we were circling the wagons.
No,
it was kind of like, hey guys, this is not going well. Let's circle the wagons and make sure everybody's being heard, because this is a very, very critical time. And honestly, Mike, during some of those critical times where people are a fear for their job is the time they'll tend to communicate the least, because they don't want to make waves, right? They don't want to. And so a safe environment where they can have that be said anonymously, where it doesn't lead back to them. From a management standpoint, I can't imagine living in a world without that, because they're not going to say it to me. They're afraid, they're afraid of their job. But if we can get out from behind that, have them take it through the assessment, oftentimes will get more. Doesn't guarantee it, by the way. But
it's such a great invitation to that conversation, because just think about that, Jim. Just think about, in trying times, your ability to reach out to me as a team member of yours, and for you to be able to say, no, Mike, really, you can trust this request. I really do want to know what it is that you need to do your job better. I really do want to know. You can tell me. That is such a powerful statement, and yet deceptively delivered through what seems to be on the surface a very transactional exchange. So I love our ability to really emotionally connect through the delivery of that statement as much as anything.
Yeah, 1 and 2. I think we got to get these. We got to get these right. They're not 1 and 2 by mistake. Right. We got to get these 2 right in the hierarchy and make sure we're doing it. Mike, we have some additional resources for folks. So let's talk a little bit about that before we go.
Yeah, I'll transition on in. So a couple things. Again, to that point, Jim, that you made about safety, there's just think about the tone. Think about what you're leaving your team members with. And so we hear the narrative, right? Makes me feel confident about my job. Most important is knowing I'm going to return to my family at the end of a shift without a scratch. When we think about physical safety, what's at stake there? Or the statement that I don't have to come to work ever thinking about a lack of equipment because it's all there. And think about all the motivation now that's revealed and helps pull performance forward as a result. And so 2 connections I want to make, and it will transition into materials and equipment that we leave our conversation with. But don't miss the mark on what materials and equipment means related to an organization's mission. And so, quite frankly, this second element really is a prerequisite to any connection then to the support of a mission or a purpose when we think about that specific item that we'll arrive at here and later on in our series. But there's a false front that we're putting up if we think that we can somehow have this aspirational goal of a mission or a purpose that we're going to arrive at, but we aren't fundamentally providing people with enough tangible resources to deliver on that mission and purpose every single day. So I want to make sure we bundle those together. A couple of ways for us to think about this as coaches, as we really deliver on outcomes and performance through our focus and emphasis of this particular item and engagement overall. 2 courses that we always want to put in front of you to consider. First and foremost is our Engagement Champions course. It's a 2-day course. It really puts you in the position of subject matter expertise and mastery, to where your coaching takes on the form of integrating engagement and a foundational level of the science and the research, but more importantly, the application of the coaching of engagement into those team leaders so they can release performance through their teams in all the ways that they aspire to. The other is another flagship course. It's our Leading High-Performing Teams. Really helps you get inside the mind of the manager. The first half, it's a 2-day course. The first half of that first day really is oriented about strengths, the self-awareness and strengths-based perspective of who that leader is, but also how they lead their teams through the collective strengths that their team represents. The second half of the first day takes us on into the world of engagement, the foundations and understanding of the science and research that backs engagement, leading on into the beginning of day number 2, where the first half of day number 2 is more engagement, leading into the application and performance expectations and delivery of an engaged workplace, and then concluding the second half of that second day with the application and the understanding of those 5 performance conversations that I mentioned earlier that came out of our re-engineering performance management research and paper. So really want to encourage you to explore those. And there's a variety of resources on shop.gallup.com. We have an engagement starter pack, which has of the book, First Break All the Rules, and the Creating Engaged Workplace Manager packet with engagement discussion cards and other question cards, and just a great foundational piece in your delivery as you think about your own coaching through engagement. So Jim, we should be set up. We've had that's a lot, I know, for a subject that's centered on one particular item around materials and equipment, but we've got that foundational piece behind us. And in our next conversation, we're set up to talk about question number 3. At work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. So I'm excited about that. I'm looking forward to what we have the chance to explore and share together.
Now we're looking forward to it as well. Remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strength Center, just gallupstrengthcenter.com. Send us your questions or comments. And if you want to do that, send it in an email to us. Probably the easiest way to get it to us, coaching@gallup.com. You can also catch the recorded version of this, plus all the past programs that we've done. And there's a bunch that are out there for you. They're all listed on our coaches blog. Head out to coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup certified strengths coach, we have a list of all our courses that lead to that certification. Many of you, a whole bunch of you, are actually going to join us for some of those certification courses during the 2018 Clifton Strengths Summit, which is coming up July 16th, 17th, and 18th. Still time to sign up, although it's getting to be close, as we think it's just June 27th. You've got, although if you're based here in Omaha, you should be joining us, and we'd love to have you come out and join us. Of course, there's a discount on those courses that are being offered during the summits if you're registered for the summit. So we'd love to have you come out. If you want to get a list of all the future Q12 sessions that are coming out here in 2018, they're on our Eventbrite page. Go to gallup.eventbrite.com. And then if you want to join in the conversation, if you want to take this to Facebook, we have a Facebook group associated with this, facebook.com/group/called2coach. We'd love to have you join us there. We'll look forward to the next one, Mike. Always great to have you. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody. All right, if you're listening live, thanks for joining us. Great to have you guys out there in the chat room today. Not a ton of chat, but hopefully you were mesmerized by the material. That's what we're hoping for. We'll see you guys. I think, Mike, we're on for next week, right? We're doing this again?
I think,
no, 2 weeks.
I think it's 2 weeks, yeah. Yeah, 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure we're off next week.
Oh, that's right. It's 4th of July.
4th of July.
4th of July here. As well as it's the 4th of July every place else as well. We just celebrate it. So, all right, with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.